funerals I find can be uplifting when it's an elderly person who's lived a long life and everything like that, and there's kind of like a bittersweet joy and stuff like that. And the few times I've assisted at the funeral of a child, though, I feel traumatized. Me, I feel like I'm not right for a few days. It's something very, very difficult about it. I remember many years ago when I was parish in Miami, and it was a funeral for a child, and I remember the pastor getting up and saying, it's not right for parents to bury their children. There's something disordered about that. And it is extremely difficult, something I have 3 children, I couldn't imagine what you have been through and what you're going through. Last year, in January of last year, I happened to, I subscribed to New York Times online edition. So what I particularly like about it is sometimes there are comments afterwards. So this was in the opinion pages. It was in January 10th of last year. I was just reading it, and I was so struck by it. It was called Getting Grief Right. And after I read it, I saved it. I've only saved maybe 5 or 6 of these things in a few years. This is one that I saved, and I actually, after I read it, I sent it to Denise, because I felt it was very helpful for anyone experiencing grief, and I felt like it shed a new light, a new perspective on the process of grieving that I thought was helpful. What I found particularly significant is one of the neat things about this online capability is people can comment on an article. And so what I noticed is as soon as this article was published, the comments were like off the charts. People, and I just checked this morning, so far there's like 400 responses to this. That's unusual. And I believe all of them were thank you. And all of them were sharing a little bit of their story. And it was just a beautiful thing that just kind of like came out of nowhere. But I thought if we have time, I'd just like to read to you. The article is written by a psychotherapist who has experienced loss of his child in dealing with his practice and coming to a new understanding of grief. I mean, you all know about the stages of grief, right? And how many is it? 7? Is it first is anger and denial? What are the stages? Do you know them? Anger.
Bargaining.
What is it?
Bargaining.
Bargaining, yeah. Okay. And bargaining is good. Yeah, excellent.
Deal.
Yeah, and then that's been kind of like the standard for grief. It's like how do you fit with the 7 stages of grief? And so this psychotherapist takes a different perspective. And if we have time, I'd like to share this with you, what he said, because I find, so he said, by the time Mary came to see me, 6 months after losing her daughter to sudden infant death syndrome, she had hired and fired 2 other therapists. She was trying to get her grief right. Mary was a successful accountant, a driven person who was unaccustomed to being weighed down by sorrow. She was also well-versed in the so-called stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. To her and so many others in our culture, that meant grief would be temporary and somewhat predictable, even with the enormity of her loss. She expects to be able to put it behind her and get on with her life. To look at her, she already had done so. The mask she wore for the world was carefully constructed and effective. She seemed to epitomize what many people would call doing really well, meaning someone who had experienced a loss but looked as if they had just finished grieving. Within a few days of the death of her daughter, she was back at work and seemed to function largely as before. The truth of her life was something else. 6 months after her baby's death, she remained in deep despair. She was exhausted from acting better than she felt around co-workers, friends, and family. As is so often the case, she had diagnosed her condition as being stuck in grief, believing that a stubborn depression was preventing her from achieving acceptance and closure. Was she in denial? She wondered. She also wondered if she was appropriately angry. The bottom line was that she knew she was depressed. The psychiatrist had prescribed an antidepressant, and that is what she wanted me to treat. Earlier in my practice, I would have zeroed in on that depression. Was there a family history? Had she been depressed before? Was the medicine helping? What were her specific symptoms? Knowing the answers might suggest why she was stuck. Or I would have reviewed the stages of grief as she had, looking for one in which the work remained incomplete. But I had begun to operate differently by the time Mary showed up, which was 10 years after my own loss. My firstborn child had also died before he was a year old. It was why Mary had chosen me. In our first session, I put Mary's depression aside. I asked her to tell me the story of her baby rather than describe the symptoms of her grief. Though she was resistant, she eventually started to talk. Like most of the things in Mary's life, the baby, whom she named Stephanie, was planned. Mary was delighted with her pregnancy and had wonderful dreams with her daughter. After a routine delivery, Mary stayed home with Stephanie for the first 3 months. Returning to work had been difficult, but Mary was comfortable with the child care arrangement and managed to balance motherhood with her busy professional schedule. Then Mary told me about the Saturday when she went to check on her napping daughter and found that Stephanie wasn't breathing. She began CPR as her husband called 911. There were moments of surreal focus as she and her husband tried to save their baby. Then this woman, so accustomed to being in control, had surrendered her daughter to an emergency crew. Her husband drove as they followed the ambulance to the hospital. She described the waiting room in great detail, down to the color of the furniture. When the hospital chaplain walked in with the doctor, she knew her baby was born. She and her husband were taken into a room where they held the baby for the last time. At this point in the story, Mary finally began to weep, intensely so. She seemed surprised by the waves of emotion that washed over her. It was the first time since the death that the sadness had poured forth in that way. She said she had never told the story of her daughter from conception to death in one sitting. "What's wrong with me?" she asked as she cried. "It has been almost 7 months." Very gently, using simple, non-clinical words, I suggested to Mary that there was nothing wrong with her. She was not depressed, or stuck, or wrong. She was just very sad, consumed by sorrow, not because she was grieving incorrectly. The depth of her sadness was simply a measure of the love she had for her daughter. That's a wonderful line, isn't that? The depth of her sadness was simply a measure of the love she had for her daughter. I find that can be consoling sometimes when you think of how much you're grieving, how much pain there is, and how that is totally related to how much love there was. It's almost like a reminder of the love. A transformation had occurred when she heard this. She continued to weep, but the muscles in her face relaxed. I watched as months of pent-up emotions were released. She had spent most of her energy trying to figure out why she was behind in her grieving. She had buried her feelings and vowed to be strong because that's how a person was supposed to be. Now in my office, stages, self-diagnosis, and societal expectations didn't matter. She was free to surrender to her sorrow. As she did, the deep bond with the little girl was rekindled. Her loss was now part of her story, one to claim and cherish, not a painful event to try and put in the past. I had gone through the same process after the loss of my son. I was in my second year of practice when he died, and I subsequently had many grieving patients referred to me. The problem in those early days was that my grief training was not helping either my parents or me, my patients or me. When I was trained in the late 70s, the stages of grief were the standard by which a grieving person's progress was assessed. That model is still deeply and rigidly embedded in our cultural consciousness and psychological language. It inspires much self-diagnosis and self-criticism among the aggrieved. This is compounded by the often subtle and well-meaning judgment of the surrounding community. A person is to grieve for only so long or with so much intensity. To be sure, some people who come to see me exhibit serious diagnosable symptoms that require treatment. Many, however, seek help only because they and the people around them believe that time is up on their grief. The truth is that grief is as unique as a fingerprint, confirms to no timetable, or societal expectation. I've always believed that grief has a life of its own. You can't control it, right? It's just like you kind of ride it like a wild horse. It's comes, goes, no rhyme or reason. Why did I cry just now? It's just like happened. And I like what he's saying. It's unique to each person. Based on my own and my patient's experiences, I now like to say that the story of loss has 3 chapters. So it's kind of like rethinking the 7 stages and saying, let's think of it as a story with 3 chapters. Chapter 1 has to do with attachment, the strength of the bond with the person who has been lost, understanding the relationship between degree of attachment and intensity of grief brings great relief to most patients. I often tell them the size of their grief corresponds to the depth of their love. Chapter 2, the death event itself. This is often the moment when the person experiencing the loss begins to question his or her sanity, particularly when the death is premature and traumatic. Mary had prided herself on her ability to stay in control in difficult times. Profound emotional chaos of her baby's death made her feel crazy. As soon as she was able, she resisted the craziness and shut down the natural pain and suffering. In chapter 3, it's the long road that begins at the last casserole dish is picked up, and the outside world starts grieving with you. Mary wanted to reassure her family, friends, and herself that she was on the fast track to closure. This was exhausting. What she really needed was to let herself sink into the sadness and acceptance. When I suggested a support group, Mary rejected the idea, but I insisted. She later described the relief she felt in the presence of other bereaved parents in a place where no acting was required, in a place where people understood that they didn't really want to achieve closure at all. To do so would be to lose a piece of the sacred bond. Isn't that beautiful? Beautiful. And that's what we're doing here. You know, this is a place not seeking closure. This is a place to be and to experience and to allow the grief to heal one another and to support one another. All sorrows can be born. We put them in a sorrow or tell a story about them, said Wright and Isaac Vincent. When loss is a story, there's no right or wrong way to grieve. There's no pressure to move on. There's no shame in intensity or duration. Sadness, regret, confusion, yearning, and all the experiences of grief become part of the narrative of love for the one God. And I like to sing this song now called When Answer's Not Enough. I only do it in very difficult situations where, again, it's not a death that can be, just assumed like for an elderly parent or so. But it's just a song, again, like our Father was talking about. Our comfort is the presence of Jesus. Displayed in the story of Emmaus, that they were comforted that he was there with them. And they were able to tell them of how frustrated they were and how the dreams had been dashed because when they believed, how they were crucified. But the gift that Jesus gave was simply his presence. He was there with them. And that brought them strength and that brought them joy. And in our grief, there is no greater solace, there's no greater balm, there's no greater soothing help like ointment. And in the presence of one another, willingly given to help in this. And of course, the eternal, always with us, presence of Jesus, who quietly often holds us and weeps with us. It was interesting too when we think of Gethsemane and what Jesus wanted from his disciples was to stay there and pray with them. Jesus himself found great comfort in just the presence of his friends, and just being there. So this is a song called When Answers Are Enough.
You have faced the mountain of desperation. You have climbed, you have fought, you have won. But this valley that lies coldly before you casts a shadow you cannot overcome. And just when you think you had it all together, and you knew every verse to get you through, this time all the sorrow, it broke more than just your heart. And reciting all those verses just won't do. When answers aren't enough, there is Jesus. He is more than just an answer to your prayer. And your heart will find a safe and peaceful refuge. When answers aren't enough, He is there. Instead of asking why did it happen, think of where it can lead you from here. And as your pain is slowly easing, you can find a greater reason to live your life triumphant through the tears. When answers aren't enough, there is Jesus. He is more than just an answer to your prayer. And your heart will find a safe and peaceful refuge. When answers aren't enough, He is there. When answers aren't enough, He is here.